Good day and welcome to the 6th edition of the SASI Debate Challenge. This battleground of intellect is brought to you by SAYWHAT with support from the Swedish Embassy in Zimbabwe. We are on episode 8. I am your debate mistress, formerly known as Nicole Natsai-Chimanikire, but powerfully known as Dr. Nicole. Let the games begin. And the motion reads: herd immunity or community immunity occurs when a high percentage of the community is immune to a disease through vaccination and or prior illness, making the spread of this disease from person to person unlikely. This House regrets herd immunity policies in the eradication of tuberculosis. I will repeat again. Herd immunity or community immunity occurs when a high percentage of the community is immune to a disease through vaccination and or prior illness, making the spread of this disease from person to person unlikely. This House regrets herd immunity policies in the eradication of tuberculosis. Moving swiftly and somersaulting into our argument, I will be asking the Prime Minister to come through and make their case.
Panel, the motion which this House regrets the herd immunity to eradicate the herd immunity policies to eradicate TB. First of all, we want to look at the regret criteria within this debate for opening government, and we think that we regret something when it fails to do its intended purpose, and we also think that we regret something when it has more harms than good, right? And then thirdly, we think that we regret something when it has outlived its usefulness within society. But today we're going to look at when we regret something because it has failed and when it has more harms than good, and I'm going to deal with that. But first of all, a bit of characterization on what exactly developing nations look like and what exactly tuberculosis looks like, right? First of all, we think when we talk about developing nations, we talk about nations that are characterized by a lack of infrastructure, lack of economic support, lack of financial support, lack of and a lot of diseases that affect them, a lot of needs that they need to attend to, right? And when we look at TB, we think that this is an infectious airborne disease, right, which is spread through the air, and at the end of the day, it's something that kills you over a long period of time and doesn't necessarily need so much agency to say that it warrants herd immunity policies, right? So how exactly are we going to frame our arguments? First of all, we're going to talk about how the fact that there has been a lack of buy-in, right, such that herd immunity policies have failed. Why? We think that when we are looking at developing nations, we're looking at nations that are characterized mainly by religious and traditional beliefs, and people traditionally just don't choose to buy into things that choose like have immunization or vaccination, right, because of these beliefs that are pretty much adamant within those particular societies, right? And at the end of the day, we think that the governments have been wasting a lot of funds, right, which are much needed in other respective areas to achieve a better society, right? And we're also going to tell you why exactly our word is much better when I conclude my speech as compared to that we're going to get from opposition side, right? But then we'll also tell you about the incapacity of these developing nations to facilitate herd immunity, right? We tell you that the reason why it has been failing, right, is the fact that it is not a matter of urgent need. Therefore, there's been a lack of economic support from the international and the global community that is much needed, right? When you look at pandemics like COVID-19, Ebola, smallpox, etc., right? These were issues of agents, right? And that's why there was a lot of buy-in from the international community, from the global community, right, to stop this particular thing, right? But because this is something that mainly affects developing nations, there's no pandemic of TB like developed nations in the US, right, or in the Western world, right? Such that they don't really care and they don't really provide like the necessary finances that are needed to combat this particular thing. We think that finances, right, are left to the duty of like coming up with finances and dealing with this particular thing, right, are left to the governments of those people, right, who lack those necessary funds, and they're characterized by so many debts, right, to the IMF and to the World Bank and so forth, right, such that at the end of the day, right, you are making an uphill task, something that is inachievable, right, but still requiring a lot of money year after year, right, and still exists on the national budget. And we think like these disadvantages, like the general public, like, and this like doesn't address the much more urgent needs within society, because when you look at TB, right, TB is not as deadly as COVID-19. It doesn't kill you within a matter of days, right? It takes hours, and there's a cure, right? Unlike COVID-19 or Ebola or smallpox, right? When we're talking about matters of need, right, we're talking about the fact that instead of going on to immunize and vaccinate each and every single person or a large majority of the population, right, rather we let people, right, live in a society while it's trying to address these health issues that are existent, right, on an equity basis, right? We're talking about acute respiratory disease that exist in these developing nations. We're talking about things like typhoid, right, cholera, and so many other diseases, right? And what we are suggesting is team opening government to say that all of these things, right, like need to have the same amount of like conviction from the government. That is not to say that you are going to say you are going to have like herd immunity only for TB, right, and look to eradicate TB, right, because this does not speak to the idea of equitable distribution of funds to other health needs that exist within the society, because they lack those funds as developing nations, right. So at the end of the day, we still think the idea of lack of agents, right, is something that we need to look at and something that is important in today's debate, and with this we are more proud to propose. Thank you.
That was the Prime Minister diving into our debate here. I will move swiftly on and call upon the Leader of Opposition to make their case.
Panel, before I start this debate, I would like to exclude opening government from them not understanding what really the motion is about today. We think that TB is a killer disease today because we have somehow became to solve the struggle that we're having with COVID-19, right? We ought to come back to realizing how then do we solve the killer disease that we have in status quo, which is TB. We think that first thing that we don't understand in today's debate is talk about how there's low lack of buying in people. We think that the willingness that was there in people like fighting COVID is the same willingness that people are willing to get vaccinated for COVID, which means people are willing to particularly protect themselves from this particular disease, right? Then we also get this idea of funding, right? That our governments also do not have funding. But we think that TB largely is not it's a global thing, right? Even if you don't have funding in Zimbabwe, the international community such as WHO or UNICEF or other organizations are willing to particularly help you in terms of donating vaccines, like the issue that happened with COVID, right? Which is where particularly we get more utility. We get also this nonsensical argument of saying that we want to prioritize other diseases. We think that TB is killing more than cholera. TB is more detrimental more than TB is a pandemic, but cholera in principle is not a pandemic. So we are more justified, particularly to, as a government, to not regret the stance of solving these things in terms of herd immunity, right? Why particularly do we think that herd immunity is very important in developing states? One, I've told you how this inability of the states to like end these diseases like on their own, because Zimbabwe has been failing to even apportion like a certain amount of like 15% of the particular budget to the health system. We think that the health system is in shambles, right? At a point in time when we advocate and we prioritize herd immunity, it means that we're gonna have less people being sick by TB, less people being diagnosed to say that they have TB, right? Because that particular capacity to handle TB, we don't have it, right? Three things that are going to give into this debate, right? Firstly, how do we reduce the transmission of TB in today's debate, right? We think that when Dr. Chiwenga says that munhu wese ngaende vaccination, it means that he envisions as a minister to say that at a point in time when we have transmissions, right, they are reduced in terms of like we have a lot of people that are now vaccinated, and even the health capacity that exists in our hospitals is able to like give health services to these people, right? Thirdly, we think that we are protecting vulnerable groups, right? We think that TB largely and disproportionately affects poor people who live in small houses because it's an airborne disease, right? That's why when we vaccinate people, we look at areas where particularly that disease is rampant, right? And we prioritize vaccinating them in those particular areas. Like how when we were vaccinating people for COVID, we vaccinated people that were more in urban areas, right? When we're vaccinating people and creating like herd immunity for these particular individuals, or vaccinating people that exist in rural areas, right? Which means that we curb the spread of these things in rural areas, right? And also we think that we value the reduction of the burden of the disease. We think that developing states are shambled financially, right? They do not have money. We think that also what we ought to understand that a pandemic creates so much economic restraints, such as COVID created that particular thing to the Zimbabwean economy, right? We value a point in time when we reduce the burden of the state carrying this particular thing, right? In principle, we think pandemics have been overcome or we have won by particularly using herd immunity. Look at how we won over measles, right? Look at how we won over COVID. We think that precedent that exists in terms of fighting these diseases using herd immunity is what we do not regret, particularly exclusively from our side of the debate, right? What also other things are going to be given to you by Tan? Tan is going to tell you how particularly not regretting this provides a cost-effective mechanism for developing states, and also we get more feasibility in terms of like reducing particularly the rise of the spread of COVID, and we protect vulnerable groups that do not have money in terms of like accessing that particular treatment, and also we reduce the burden on the state that is already in shambles. With this, we beg to propose.
That was the Deputy Prime Minister making his case. This is the first quarter of the debate, and at this point we will be taking a short break. Stay tuned and we'll be back with more. Welcome back to the 6th edition of the SASI Debate Challenge. This is the Speak and Solve initiative brought to you by Say What with support from the Swedish Embassy in Zimbabwe. We will now be moving on to the Deputy Prime Minister. Deputy Prime Minister of Opening Government, the floor is yours.
So what we get from the opening opposition is a whole lot of information about how they think TB is a global pandemic, and also how developing countries are in shambles. But we feel like this debate from the perspective of the opening opposition was not addressed in a status quo perspective, and this is because this is a regret motion. We thought they would come here and regret something that is already in place in a status quo perspective. But what we have is a miscomprehension of the motion, because we have such things as TB being a global thing, a global pandemic, yet it has never been declared. It has never warranted a state of national emergency, and if it were really a global pandemic, it would have attracted international assistance. Now, it is important that we take note that developing countries are prone to such things as religious beliefs, social dogma, and traditional whatnot. This makes them susceptible to conspiracies, and this has made it more impossible and difficult to attain herd immunity. We saw this during the COVID era, how people were refusing to be vaccinated because a lot of such things, as I mentioned before. This proves that this has very low prospects for success, and we don't think it's wise for a developing countries to be putting strength and attention to such things as achieving herd immunity for TB. Moving on, we think that since the motion confines us to developing countries, this brings us to the issue of incapacity. We mean, even if we wanted to prioritize and allocate things to achieving herd immunity in as far as TB is concerned, we do not have the capacity to finance ourselves and to do that at the expense of other things, because I think as developing countries, we work on a need basis and need principles. We do not do things that we do not actually need to do. This is unlike COVID, where the pandemic was actually declared a global pandemic and there was international support. And we think that there is lack of urgency to warrant importance. We think that since this is we think that as a matter of fact, TB can be treated, and if it is treated, it does not become serious. And we have statistics like TB killing half of its patients in a space of 5 years. And we've also seen a lot of TB policies which have been put in place, and we think they're taking very long to try and convince us that TB is actually a matter of urgency. And we therefore feel like it does not have enough urgency that is attached to it for us to think that we should need to prioritize or put more resource allocations to it. We think that developing countries face a lot of other serious health issues like cancer treatment mechanisms, which are relatively more serious and deadly as compared to TB. And prioritizing TB as a disease would be imprudent in this case. But because we think this has been going on for long and that we have other problems and health problems, we are not trying to do away with the herd immunity for TB totally, but we do think that putting more attention and resources to it will lead to inequitable allocation of funds and resources, because it is expensive for us to then and try to achieve herd immunity for this disease when it has failed to prove over the years, ever since its existence, that it can be deadly to that extent. I don't know where you got this information that TB is a global pandemic, which is a very sad thing in this debate. At the end of the day, we think we've done more justice to this motion in proving that this TB thing is not urgent, and it might inconvenience us. With this, never been proud.
There will always be two sides of a coin, and after hearing from the opening government, we will now be hearing from the opening opposition. Deputy Leader of Opposition, the floor is yours.
So there's definitely something that we agree on as the opening half, which is the fact that Zimbabwe and its health institutions and facilities do not have the capacity to deal with a crisis, right? So in our side of the house, we then ask the question, what would better help a situation in the event that we do have an outbreak of tuberculosis? And the one thing that they sideline, that they deliberately decide to ignore, is the fact that before COVID-19, tuberculosis was one of the most deadliest diseases and the #1 killer disease that the country has experienced so far. So what do we bring to you in our side of the house? We try to explain to you how prevention is something that we value of cure. Why? Because our health facilities are incapacitated. Some of our nurses are busy gallivanting somewhere in the UK doing nurse aid, and we find that first of all, we're understaffed, and secondly, you will go to like 10 hospitals across the country and you'll not find paracetamol, and you're likely to die from a headache in Zimbabwe. And this is something that shows how dire the situation is and how it's important for us to push for something that's likely to prevent a crisis from breaking out to begin with. One of their major arguments is the fact that Zimbabwe as a country is incapacitated financially. We tell you that the moment, say 60%, the moment tuberculosis breaks out and becomes a crisis, the country is in a position to declare it as an international crisis, right? And that's where bodies like WHO, bodies like the UN then intervene. It doesn't also necessarily have to be monetarily, but they can donate vaccines. This is something that we've already seen happening during the COVID-19 era, when China came out to donate almost all of the vaccines that we then use to manage the crisis. And then they also talk about how it's going to be impossible because there's a lot of conspiracy theories that are going on. We tell you that there's a lot of people that we're talking about, yeah, if you take the vaccine, you're likely to react or you're likely to die. But we still managed to achieve herd immunity even during those circumstances, and we feel like precedence has shown how these things work. It has taken us through diseases such as measles. It has taken us through diseases such as polio. So history does prove and it does show that this is something that is feasible and this is something that works. So in addition to what my partner has already explained thoroughly, we'll tell you about how, firstly, herd immunity is something that we'll go for because it would technically be not feasible for us to vaccinate like 100% of the country. And vaccinating 100% of the people is something that's not necessary, because if we have 90% of the people in the room immune to a specific disease, it means that the level of transmission is significantly reduced. And the 10% that are either going to react a certain way to the vaccine or either going to fall into the trap of these conspiracy theories, even if they do avoid the vaccine, we feel like we're in a better position if above 50% of the population is then immune and protected from this particular disease. Secondly, we talk about capacity. We have proven beyond reasonable doubt, panel, that the capacity of health institutions, the capacity of the economic status of Zimbabwe would not be able to handle a crisis in the event that tuberculosis was to break out. So our best bet, the best case scenario, the best thing we can do for ourselves to prevent people from dying from such a disease would be then to make sure that at least a significant portion of the population is then vaccinated and protected. And lastly, we told you about the cost effectiveness of this. It would be, we are better off dealing with something that's not going to cost us as much money as rather than sitting back and saying, hey, we can't prioritize this because there's people that feel like their religion doesn't allow for them to do it, therefore we should then stop doing it. Or hey, we can't prioritize this because it costs a certain amount of money if the consequence of not doing that specific thing is going to cost us more money and cost us a lot of lives. And what we then need to understand and pay particular attention to is the overall efficiency of herd immunity as shown by historical data, as we have seen in this pandemic that we recently just came from. And also the important thing to note is how developing countries are likely to be affected the most by such diseases because of the economic status of the individuals and the economic status of the country as a whole. We beg to oppose. Thank you.
That was the Deputy Leader of Opposition making her case. At this point, we will be taking a short break. Stay tuned and we'll be back with more. Welcome back to the 6th edition of the SASI Debate Challenge. We will jump right back into the heated argument we were having before as we discuss herd immunity policies. I will ask the member of government to make their way to the stage and present their case. Member of government.
House regrets the panel. This House regrets the policies. Panel. This House regrets the policies that have been put in the for the eradication of tuberculosis. In today's debate panel, allow me to firstly tell you why we regret this decision, and secondly, I will tell you why the opposition was wrong to support, and thirdly, we will offer a solution to this problem, which is what the opening four did not manage to do. So why is it that we regret? The problem we are having today is that we believe that the policy failed because of the solution it was offering. TB has to be eradicated, yes, but what solution are you offering? And that is the problem that we are going to try and solve today. The reason we are regretting is, number one, there is limited protection. Unlike vaccines that provide lung protection against infections, diseases, immunity against TB actually is short-lived. This is because TB bacteria remains dormant in the body for years. This is therefore, to completely eliminate the bacteria will be nearly impossible. We are saying that the bacteria for TB does not just immediately go away just because you have injected someone. So basically, allowing a whole population to depend on a vaccination like that would be very unreasonable. And the second reason why we regret is there is incomplete protection. We are saying that herd immunity may provide incomplete protection against TB, especially in areas where the disease is endemic. This bacteria can mutate, and because they are resistant to antibiotic, it makes it even more difficult for us to trust this type of solution in solving the TB pandemic. All right, and the third point that we are saying why we regret is there is a false sense of security. Herd immunity may give people a false sense of security, leading them to believe that they are protected from TB, whilst leading them to believe that they're protected from TB if they have been vaccinated. This can lead to more dangerous outcomes. So we are saying that we can't be basing on herd immunity. So what can we do instead? Before we move on to the model that we propose as a solution, we'd like to just rebut a few points that the opening opposition proposed. You came here and you told us about the reduction of the burden to create, but you came here and told us about the reduction of the burden on government. But what we're actually saying is this: the current research has proven that the BCG, that the vaccine that is currently being used to treat TB is actually not effective. It is only effective for TB, for certain types of TB, so we cannot be basically using that. And you also came here and you told us about the cost effectiveness of this solution, where we are saying that we understand that yes, Zimbabwe may be incapacitated as a developing country, but just because we're incapacitated doesn't mean that we have to stop looking for solutions. So what solutions do we propose? Panel, we propose this following solution. Number one, education. Who are we going to be educating? We're going to be educating people that can go into communities and spread news about TB. Like right now, we already have TB champions that have been proposed. The second one we're proposing is TB screening. Thank you.
Thank you, a member of government. Will be moving swiftly on to the closing opposition. Member of opposition, please, the stage is yours.
Characterization of what regret looks like, opening government automatically becomes fourth in this debate. Because opening government, Prime Minister tells us that regrets looks like, well, something having more harms than good and something not working. But we tell you that the status quo is a success, and we tell you that herd immunity in TB has worked. We tell you that the things that you celebrate as the mark of being a Zimbabwean is not a birthmark or anything, but it is a BCG vaccination that is given for an infant, every infant in Zimbabwe, to protect them against TB. That is the reason why none none of us, all 8 of us here, have never suffered from tuberculosis. So for Tariro to tell us that TB has never been a pandemic and things like that falls out of the debate, because it was declared a pandemic decades before you were born. And that BCG that you get, one of the child's 8 killer diseases, the first one, it does not get more urgent than your introduction to life being a BCG vaccination against tuberculosis. You're not introduced to the world by a vaccination against cancer or other things like HIV, but tuberculosis, I don't think it gets more grave than that. We'll also tell you how the whole government benches us that, well, we don't have enough funds, we want to focus on other things like typhoid and cancer. Herd immunity exists even in things like typhoid. We tell you of the Mbare typhoid herd immunity vaccination and why typhoid isn't a pandemic or an epidemic in Zimbabwe. Also tell you of how things like cancer are not even contagious. If I have cancer right now, maybe I do, I can't pass it to anyone, but if I have TB and cough 8 times, all of you will be in trouble. And we think that falls out of this debate. We'll also tell you that panel, the things that we value or the things that became contentious in this debate were questions like, at what point do we regret something and what does regret something? If we're saying that we regret something when it's not giving us the good that we want from it and there's more harms, then we think that as closing opposition we take this debate, because we tell you that we are celebrating the status quo where we can sit in a closed room like this, breathing our air and sharing a mic and not being afraid of getting tuberculosis because herd immunity has worked. And we tell you that regret looks like withdrawal and cessation of TB immunization. And if that were to happen, we'd have infants dying, we'd have people dying, and that is something that we can't afford. Why can't we afford that? Because of the characterization of what developing countries that we give you, with failed and dilapidating health infrastructure and health systems that cannot handle a pandemic of any sort. And if government tells us that, well, they think that people don't like vaccines, then we'll tell you that if you're not vaccinated against COVID-19, you can't get into an aeroplane, you can't go anywhere, and that will force people to get vaccinated. And anyway, the entire point of herd immunity is not total vaccination, but vaccinating a certain percentage to protect Rudo from herself from TB, to protect Denzel from Rudo. And we think that as closing opposition, that is best realized. We give you a cost, benefit, and a stakeholders analysis. We tell you that the cost of implementing herd immunization are way less than those of trying to prevent it or treat it or cure it. We tell you what TB does. TB will eat your bones, TB will eat your lungs, and you will die whether you want it or not. But if you get a BCG vaccination as a Zimbabwean child, as a Zimbabwean resident, then you stand a chance to even live up to the point where you can debate about TB. And we think that we celebrate the status quo and we celebrate herd immunity, and for that reason we are proud to oppose. We also tell you that what do we value? We think that we value life, we value health, and we value development in developing countries. And we think that we get life if we give people a fighting chance. We also value health when we are giving people a fighting chance against tuberculosis. We also tell you how easing the burden on developing countries actually gives them time to focus on more pertinent issues like actually developing and stopping being called developing countries. And we think that this is a lifeline, this is a lifeboat. The debate is not about whether or not herd immunity is good or bad. It's about whether or not it's enough. Does it buy developing countries enough time to focus on other issues? Yes. Does it preserve life? Yes. Does it help people? Yes. Does it help society? Yes, it does. Does it prevent pandemics? Yes, it does. And by that characterization and what we give you in our stakeholder and cost-benefit analysis, closing opposition ranks above opening opposition and opening government. And closing government.
If you have a BCG, you're Zimbabwean. We will be moving on to the next quarter of our argument, but we will take a short break first before our member of opposition coughs 8 times. Stay tuned and we'll be back with more. Welcome back to the 6th edition of the SASI Debate Championship. We will be moving on with our argument, and I will call upon the government whip to come through and make their case.
Panel, we've seen a delegation that makes false claims, a delegation that talks about unupdated information. So, panel, it should be a fact to you that BCG nowadays is not quite effective on the most recent variant of TB. Maybe they are surprised. Panel, you should know that BCG was quite effective on the other former variants of TB, but nowadays it's not quite effective. which is why we are saying that is delegation. We know and we believe that we regret herd immunity policies to eradicate TB. So they came and talked about a point which stated that there is an issue of cost effectiveness, whereby we're saying that is delegation. We know that current vaccine does not effectively prevent the recent form of TB. So we've seen that in many countries of low income, they have also invested in other forms of diseases like HIV and AIDS, malaria. That's not attaining the most effective use of that's not attaining the most cost-effective use of limited healthcare. Whereby we saying that is delegation. We believe that we should impose other alternatives. As my first speaker said, she said we should rather impose education and TB screening. Whereby we saying that is delegation. We rather believe in other form of mitigations rather than working with the stated factors from the other delegation. We believe that is delegation. We know that we can stand well with other alternatives rather than those they stated. We believe as a delegation that we've come up to the podium and we stated the fact that there is limited protection associated with there's limited protection associated with the variants. Whereby we think that is delegation. We know that we regret this because the limited denied. We know that because the limited protection is affecting us as a whole because we are not achieving the herd immunity. We have many instances of people, citizens, that are not fully acknowledged of TB and that are harming the progress that we are having, which is why as a delegation we are advocating for education and improved living standards rather than what they are advocating for. So they came here and stated first claim that TB before COVID-19 was the most denied, was the most significant variant, was the most significant disease. Whereby we saying that is delegation. We rather believe that there were diseases like HIV and AIDS. So we believe that is a delegation. They should come here on a factual basis. And we are saying that is delegation. We know that we as a delegation need to act with agents so that we meet the demands that as a government we should meet so that we mitigate the effects of TB. We're saying that as delegation. We know that TB has a vaccine, BCG, but as a delegation, we know that it's not quite effective. And we know that as delegation, that there are mutations associated with variants of TB, whereby as a delegation, we know that if we do much more and research as a delegation, we would rather be in a better position to fight TB rather than claiming that the policies that are today. With this, I thank you.
That was the government whip, and without further ado, I will call upon the closing opposition whip to come through and make their case.
We have not reached a point of regret by the points raised in this debate. What we are going to tell you as the closing opposition is due to the current status quo in the context of TB, as my partner had previously alluded, right? We are looking at Zimbabwe as a developing country that has used effectively the implementation of BCG to most Zimbabwean children that are being born since 1980 coming forward, right? We're looking at how this has helped in capping new TB infections in these young people. Right. We're talking about closing government mentions the issue of AMR in TB. AMR is more of a social behavior change, whereby people diagnose themselves, self-diagnose, rather than go to clinics to get tested and get the treatment that they want. So your point is invalid, right? What we are talking about is, why is regret bad, right? By herd immunity, what we are saying is it is the only thing that we have as developing countries that we can boast of, that we can be proud of, that has helped us channel more funds into building the Gwai Kariba water project to supply Blawayo with water, right? It has provided us with infrastructure. Look at the Harare Masvingo highway, right? We are looking at moving some of those funds into developing the country, as we say we are developing countries, right? It is not a new thing that third world countries are suffering from a lot of challenges, and they are characterized by poverty and poor living conditions, right? Talk about how you mentioned that we're supposed to be channeling most of those funds into development. Yes, they are being challenged into development. A lot of housing projects are being done. A lot of housing projects are being passed daily by the government so that people try and get this the development that they need, right? When you're talking about achieving herd immunity, this is what it has, and it protects the whole populace from trying to get, from getting those diseases and this becoming full-blown pandemics, which it was back in the 1980s with the Stonewall riots when it was declared TB2, right? It is imperative to note that there are no other better alternatives for developing countries, and achieving herd immunity is of paramount importance, taking into cognizance of how there exists donor funding into complementing the work that is being done by the government. We talk of the work that is being done by BRTI to try and look into the TB that is there in Zimbabwe and how best to deal with AMR, if ever there is AMR in the TB that is there in Zimbabwe, right? We look at how saying we regret something looks like abandoning the vulnerable populations that are at high risk of getting rejected, that are at high risk of contracting this disease more than the normal population, right? It is no new thing that all of us here in our healthcare system, as previously alluded, have gotten BCG, right? And what we are saying is that was the government imperative or a government force to try and make sure that everyone is protected, as we had previously stated that TB is one of the 8 child killer diseases, right? And still stands as one, right? We come and tell you that developing countries benefit more through herd immunity, right? We talked of issues about development. We talked of issues that pertain to the development of people, be it socially, be it infrastructure-wise, right? So what we are saying is, in conclusion, what we are bringing forward is we do not regret the vaccinations that came, and we do not regret the immunization policies that we have currently into trying to eradicate TB, right? We are trying to come to a space whereby we are closing the type 2 HIV infections and TB infections, right? So to get to that, we are supposed to make sure that there is herd immunity from everyone, and that we get as most people protected from this disease as possibly can, so that we do not suffer the consequences later. With this, we are happy to close.
That was it from the closing opposition whip. As we wait for the adjudicators to deliver the results, I just have to ask a member of opposition, are you truly going to cough 8 times? Are you truly going to cough 8 times? Oh, Jehovah. I think we can proceed with the with the herd immunity policies immediately before the whole team catches tuberculosis. First podium, how are you feeling at this moment?
Shaken.
Shaken? Shaken by what?
The debate.
The debate.
Yeah, it was intense.
It was intense. The heat was becoming really, really, really intense. A second podium, how do you feel?
We're
yes. Yes.
I'm trying to figure it out.
You're trying to figure it out?
I'm not sure.
You don't know?
Nah.
Call 577. They'll help you with some psychosocial support. At this moment, I would like to call upon the chief adjudicator to come through and give us our results.
All right, thank you so much for the lovely debate. So I'll just start with the rankings and then just a brief feedback. So on a unanimous call, the call was as follows. In 4th position, we had closing government. In 2nd position and 3rd position, we had opening government. In 1st position, we had opening opposition, and in 2nd, we had closing opposition. So just a brief understanding of why we ranked the debate and where we are. So we gave you guys fourth in today's debate, primarily because firstly, the assumptions that are already in the motion is that herd immunity works. It is an understanding that in situations where you want to have immunization and all of those things, that is a policy that we can implement. The question was not whether or not the medicine exists or whether or not the medicine will work or whether TB is regressive or not. The assumption then is as a method, herd immunity will be what we'll be using to cater about. So the debate then is, are we then regretting or supporting herd immunity in that debate? So by virtue of that, it ranked you and your arguments lower than opening opposition, opening government. So the reason why you guys are third and not second or first, right? So I think everyone can agree that we had two cases that are coming from you. So you came in and said, well, there's the issue of buy-in that exists within society. LEDCs, particularly Zimbabwe, is characterized by people who don't necessarily believe in immunization. They're largely traditionalists and all of those things. Then from your DPM, we get an analysis, well, TB is not actually the pandemic it is, but initially in your speech, you talk about the problems that exist as a result of tuberculosis. Our countries such as Zimbabwe suffer as the result of tuberculosis, and how it needs to be challenged. So that contradiction on its own then made it very difficult for you, even if you had valid arguments, for you to rank above these guys and these guys, right? So the reason why closing opposition ranks second and not first, I think again, we can all agree that a lot of the arguments that then come from you guys are not exclusive to you guys. They're arguments that you piggyback of all of these guys, and we don't get extensive either critical matter or extensive analysis as to why, for example, the issue you come in and say, well, we celebrate, but that is what we get from leader of opposition in his first speech. We get the issue to say, for example, the characterization of how TB is a killer disease, and it is not to be treated as anything that is not as such. And then lastly, we get issues to do with cost effectiveness of it as a mechanism, and how in institutions, for example, as characterized by the PM speech, and then help to understand by DLO, is the fact that in institutions or in countries that are characterized by poverty, underdevelopment, and lack of funds, it is important to then use policies such as herd immunity that then allow us, for example, to tackle it. A winning argument to today's motion was the fact that herd immunity has worked previously through COVID-19, and there was no analysis whatsoever throughout the ground as to why it has not. Thank you so much. You can come for personal feedback after.
That was it. I will ask podium by podium, what is your university and what was your rank in this round? Podium 1.
We represent GZU and we were third.
We're from MSU and we're first.
Manicaland State 4th.
Lupane State University second.
Midlands State University takes this round. This is it, the 6th edition of the SASI Debate Challenge. I am your debate mistress, Nicole Natsaichimanikire, but formerly, or rather powerfully known as .co.Nicole. Until next time.